Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. I'm in San Francisco in person today, so this is a treat. I'm here with Eden Brukman with SF Environment, and I just want to unpack your story and learn more about what you're doing here in San Francisco, which is a leading green city. Eden, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, so good to be here.
So your title is Senior Green Building Coordinator, but I want to know how you got there. So take us back. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school?
Well, I was born and raised in San Diego and grew up in Southern California. And I went to school at UC Berkeley, so that brought me to Northern California for the first time.
Okay.
I studied architecture there and even made my own minor in visual communications. So visual studies was a program that was available for graduate students. And I kind of figured out a way to get the credits I needed and the breadth of program that they would recognize as a minor, which actually worked out well because I ended up pursuing my master's in visual communications as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I did that at the Edinburgh College of Art in Scotland, and I focused on children's books.
No kidding. Yeah. That's fantastic. Well, later I might ask you about your bucket list, maybe publishing some children's books, but we'll come back to that. So you must be creative, architect, the visual side of it. Has that always been a passion of yours, the creativity side?
Yeah, I always loved to draw, and I always liked math. And so my parents thought, maybe she should be in it. Maybe she should be in architecture. You know, and my father was really interested in going to open houses, and he would ask me, what could we do to fix this house? What could we do to make this layout more effective or efficient? So I was doing that kind of stuff from early age. And so when I was 8, I said I wanted to be an architect, and I thought it was going to be a more practical application for artistic kind of expression. Yeah.
And, sustainability. I have to assume you were growing up in California, a green state, but how'd you know I want to get into sustainability? Did you have an aha moment, or have you always been really passionate about this?
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't know that I really thought of it as being sustainably minded. Mm-hmm. I was really interested in architecture in part because I was curious about the way that we shape it, but that how it shapes us as well. And I never knew quite how to articulate that until I started to understand some ecological principles. And so I explored passive systems when I was in high school. I started thinking about materials when I went and did a college course at Cornell University as a high school student.
Oh, wow. Fun.
And that was a way, because I knew I wanted to be an architect, but I'd heard the horror stories of architecture schools. And I thought, well, maybe I should check this out before I make a commitment, because you have to apply directly into the program when you apply for that major.
Right. And
so I got to explore it there. But when I got to Berkeley, I had incredible professors like Gail Brager and Chris Benton teaching passive systems, and Renee Chow, and graduate student instructors David Galbraith, he was actually doing a joint program in structural engineering and architecture. So learning from people who are thinking more comprehensively about the purpose of what we're building and how to make it function optimally. So it was less about sustainability and more about kind of responding and respecting the resources that we were using.
It sounds like they were doing that before any rating systems or anything like that. It's like, here's the right way to do it. Here's the best practices. And you were learning from some of the best.
Yeah, I was so lucky to be at Berkeley at that time.
And that's kind of my follow-up is just, did you have any other mentors or anyone that opened some doors with you during your career there?
I feel like I was really fortunate that I've been able to have that path, the trajectory of exposure to so many different things. Had a number of people I would think of as mentors, but also people who inspired me. I've long followed the philosophy of Buckminster Fuller, so I kind of gravitated towards people who had that kind of similar way of thinking. As far as people in the field, I try to learn from everyone. I know that if that's might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but there were definitely people who helped shepherd me along the way, but every day was a learning experience. And that's kind of how I focused my career, was to make sure that no matter what I'm doing at work, that every day I'm learning something new.
I really second that. I think you have to be that continual learner, or just always wanting to learn. But let's unpack it for those listening that maybe are young professionals. Do you just ask a lot of questions, or do you, if there's an opportunity, do you just go after it? Like, tell us a little more about what maybe you did to make sure you were learning or getting access to opportunities there.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. On the one hand, I was young in an office.
Sure. A lot of energy.
In some cases, the only female, or one of the few females in the office. And so being kind of that A-type personality, I wanted to succeed. I needed to kind of do something extra to be noticed, because it's a competitive environment there.
Gotcha.
I started, my first job out of college was on the Getty Center working for Richard Meyer. Oh, wow. So this is a high-profile project in a very competitive space. And so I think there's a little bit of both. I'd ask questions, but I'd come prepared. I'd understand, they're going to be doing some water testing on that aspect of the museum today. I studied the details, and then I went and asked questions from the people who are going to be in the job trailer. And they said, you know what? Get a hard hat, come up with this, and watch. So showing that I was actively interested in not just the things that I wanted to know about, but things that other people were interested in too. I think that you kind of have to know your audience a little bit and understand that even if it's might on the surface not sound like something that's your most exciting thing, like water testing it actually, there's so much to be learned from it. And then on the flip side, I did a lot of research. I just read a lot. I studied, some of my favorite architects were Gaudí, or Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles René McIntosh, Kahn and Alto, Scarpa. These were the people that I had books on, and I would pore over. And I would go to the library and get details on bricks when I found out I was working on a project that was going to be using bricks. So I was joking around with someone the other day about how I'd like to kind of, instead of the idiom measure twice, cut once, I'm kind of more of the measure 4 times and fold. I like to be prepared for things. So that only helped others understand that I was committed, I was serious, and I was someone that they could invest time in.
Yeah, even what I'm hearing is stay curious and be intentional. And what I've found is if someone is a great teacher, they'll boil it down when you're asking them questions to like the cliff notes that you really need to know about that thing. And so I think that's really cool. So architecture, you were doing that for a number of years. We'll get into how you got more into sustainability, but what's one thing you really liked about architecture? What's one thing you didn't? It's okay to be honest, as you made that career change.
Well, I think with architecture, it's our solution for human habitat, right? These are the choices that we're making to meet our needs. And so I think that that's a really powerful thing, and it has a lot of influence on our day-to-day lives. And that's something that I wanted to explore. I think also it's fun. Architecture is a social science. We have to learn everything about our client, whoever the end user is, in order to design something that will be successful for them. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of exploration, getting to know something completely foreign. And I really love that about architecture. I think one of the things that helped me with my transition away from practice, in part it was some of the tools that were kind of being used differently than I would imagine. As CAD was becoming more integrated into design practices, I was finding, it was that much faster for a Revit model to look like a finished building. And so it wasn't uncommon for designs to be done on a Saturday morning, and then you just move on and build. And I just thought the pace was a little intimidating, or it made me a little nervous for the kind of imprint we were about to make without necessarily the time to think it through. And I think that starts to link pretty directly to sustainability as well. You're thinking about, the resources it will take to build this, and have we really thought that this is the right thing? So Revit as senior architect is to me a little dangerous. And I still came up at a time when, yes, all my colleagues were doing CAD. I was doing ink on Mylar still.
Okay.
And I became very quickly into CAD when I had to at work. But that wasn't my first job. My first job was hand drawing.
Wow. Yeah, with Revit, let's unpack that for a minute. I think the statistic is that 80% of all construction projects over $5 million in value are designed in Revit. Mm-hmm. And so we have a lot of Revit happening. And there's a big gap, though, from the architect handing it off to the contractor and manufacturers to the operations team. So just there's still a lack of trust, I think, in that, hey, let's use the Revit model and hand it off. But, yeah, I could understand how just too fast of a pace, someone's cutting some corners on something.
Well, don't get me wrong. I think that there is a tremendous value to it when used as a tool.
Gotcha.
Being able to eliminate some of the coordination issues that happen on construction sites because you don't have that ability to see in 3 dimensions all the time. I think that there's when the MEP package can be brought into the architectural drawings, and now what people are doing with virtual reality or augmented reality with it, there's a lot of benefits to the technology when it is understood that it is a tool.
Gotcha.
When it becomes more than that I think that's when we have to. We still are ultimately responsible for our designs, and I think that accountability can't be transferred to something that was never intended to have that weight applied to it.
Very fair point. So you were in-house sustainability on the architecture side, but then you made a change, and you've been called a living building hero. So talk about your time on the living building side.
Well, that was an incredible time in my life, and I'm every day I'm eternally grateful for the opportunity that I had to do Living Building Challenge. When I started on Living Building Challenge, Jason McLennan had brought it to Cascadia Green Building Council, and it was effectively a couple pages of at that time they were called prerequisites.
Sure.
Things that had to be done in order to be at that restorative end. And one thing I really appreciated about the idea behind the program is that it started with the end game in mind. So how far can we push the envelope literally and figuratively, right? And then one thing I liked about my time with Living Building Challenge, I worked on the program for 5 years with the folks at ILFI, now International Living Future Institute. The first few years, I was the only full-time staff working on the program, working with all the project teams, seeing what issues they were having. We didn't have documentation requirements at the very beginning. We didn't have a user guide. We didn't have a lot of answers because it was more or less like a manifesto, right?
Sure.
And so being able to take that idea and turn it into something that could be done, and then see how people took it and ran with it. Every day was kind of incredible. I'd be at a 1 and a 10 of every day, right? My goal was to end on a 10.
Sure.
But, the 1 was because I wish I had more of the tools to offer people. I wish I had more things codified or finished. And the 10 would be, someone giving me a call and telling me about some amazing way that they were going to be dealing with water on their site, or the way that they interacted with their greater community in order to have their project have an outsized impact, It was super interesting. And as a result, I think we've seen some really good changes in the industry because of the program and how people have been able to identify with it. I'd like to think of Living Building Challenge as a philosophy first and an advocacy tool second, and then a certification program third, because we really do have to change how we think to change what we say and then ultimately change what we do. And it became that framework that helped, I hope, embrace everyone on the spectrum participating, because everyone has their own path, and we need to embrace that path and give people the ability and hopefully some help along the way to bring them along and for them to bring others along.
It's exciting. I wonder if this is a fair comparison. The 4-minute mile banister, like it was impossible until someone did it. Maybe a living building. See, you can do it, and now I think the count's going up pretty high. We've had Sean Aurora, who's going to be running the Georgia Tech living building that's coming online in September on the podcast, and just, it's doable. You can do it.
Well, that's the thing. I used to joke, it's called the Living Building Challenge, not the Living Building Impossible. All of the aspects of the program were done before. The idea was to try to eliminate hidden trade-offs, right?
Gotcha.
To really think comprehensively about our impacts. And so while we knew that individually some of these thresholds have been met, what happens when you start to put them together? What's that multiplier? What's that factor that can happen? How does it change the way we think? I think so much of the Living Building Challenge is not in the imperatives themselves, but in kind of the rewiring of the brain that has to happen in order to approach them. I brought a lot of advocacy into the tool, such as the material requirements. With the Red List, I brought in the requirements for constructive cooperative communication, the letter writing or the communication between manufacturers and the suppliers, to be able to say, like, help me understand what I need to know, because you are the expert. You know everything about the product. Help me understand it, because I'm getting questions that I don't know how to approach. How can we work together in order to meet the goals of my client, or to meet this priority that's been established for whatever reason, right? I think that that's a really critical way to raise all ships, as it were, instead of what I was seeing was that combative relationship, between manufacturers and consumers. You're out to kill my grandkids, or, you're intentionally trying to lie to me about what's in the product. And that was heartbreaking for me. Yeah. So trying to bring that constructive side of things was really important.
It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, rising tide. So having a hand in building the Living Building Challenge got to be on your list of big accomplishments. So Absolutely. What else stands out? Eden, if you look at the highlight reel, what are a couple things that stand out?
So when I came to Living Building Challenge, I was half Living Building Challenge and half Pharos Project. So I was really lucky to work with the folks at Healthy Building Network and at the time University of Tennessee Center for Clean Products in partnership with Cascadia on the Pharos Project in its early days. Also as a way to start to highlight what otherwise would be hidden trade-offs when we start to make design decisions, and what are the impacts of the material choices that we make. That was another big highlight for me. And the tail end of my time at ILFI, actually before that even, another highlight was working on the Ambassador Network. I created that as a way to, kind of started as a trainer program, really. Sure. Someone contacted me in Delaware and asked me if I could come to do a brown bag, and I thought, that's a long way to go from Portland. But I can train you how to do it. Smart. And so we created that, and then that grew into the collaboratives on the ground and creating, fostering environments that people can learn from each other and work together to make big changes in the building movement where they live based on the priorities there. That was another thing that I still get teary when I meet people who say that they're Living Building Ambassadors, Living Building Challenge Ambassadors, or part of the Living Future Ambassador Network now, as they call it. After I left ILFI, I became the first technical director for the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. I worked with Tom Lent at HBN and Jennifer Atlee at Building Green at the time, and others to put together the Health Product Declaration. And then I got to direct its purpose for the following 2 years, its first 2 years. So with a lot of stakeholders and wonderful invested human beings who wanted to understand more about hazards in building materials and how to communicate those to others as a way to hopefully influence the R&D of the supply chain.
And so with the HPD collaborative, that brought you to the Bay Area?
No, not necessarily. No, the HPD was a teleworking thing, so I moved here. I moved back to the Bay Area because it just felt like it was time to come back. Cool. I was here not too long before I made the move in 2013, and just noticed that the city was talking to me again, and I thought I need to respond to that. It's just the university seemed to be pulling me in that direction, but it seems to be like the right place for me to be at least right now. I was doing consulting for a few years in between leaving Health Product Declaration Collaborative and working here at the city, doing all number of stuff outside of the building industry as well as inside the building industry. So I got to work on the global goals, the SDGs, with a group out of Sweden, and I got to think about how different cities relate to one another when they are in similar climate zones with another international group, and thinking about how do we approach solutions for regenerative agriculture on a global scale. So I had a lot of fun. And at the same time, I was doing some consulting with Green Science Policy Institute, Eden Brukman and company there, talking about her classes and helping to translate those scientific theories into things that would be easy for architects and just general consumers to understand.
You've got to be proud of the Living Building Challenge success and SDGs. Obviously, it's a big part of everything we're seeing with entire cities following the SDGs and some of the students you've had impact on. But fast forward to today. So here we are at your office here in San Francisco. So tell us more about what's keeping you busy today.
Well, we're working on a lot of things. We're pretty busy here. There's lots to do. Just when I think one of the things that's kind of on the forefront of a lot of cities in California's mind right now is electrification of our buildings. We have the opportunity right now being on the verge of another code cycle being implemented January 2020 to think about what are the reach opportunities for how our buildings operate. And so we're exploring how to start that shift away from dependency on natural gas to electrification, and then of course having that be fueled by renewable energy and still maintain energy efficiency.
Sure.
Yeah, that's
tough. And so tell us a little more about SF Environment and just how that relates to the city. I mean, you're setting the mandates, you're setting the codes. Help us understand just from a high level what the goal is here.
So that's a good question, because SF Environment, it's a little different than you might see in other cities. I like to think of us a bit like a think and do tank nested within a government structure.
Okay.
So we're conveners. We write policy, and we work collaboratively with other departments in order to help the city meet its environmental goals. We're not an enforcement agency.
Okay.
So we partner with other agencies around those issues. So for example, DBI, the Department of Building Inspection, is going to be reviewing drawings and designs for compliance with the code. But we certainly have an influence on the content of the San Francisco Green Building Code, right?
Gotcha.
So there's a partnership there. So as a result, we do a lot of research, a lot of education, outreach. We have a number of different themes throughout the department. One thing that I find really interesting is that the Green Building Program sits within a greater team that also includes climate and environmental justice. So the three of us really go hand in hand as we think about some of these larger systemic issues.
Yeah, I do work in New York City and the New York City Department of Buildings and the local laws there. I think it sounds like, they issue the mandates and they enforce them. But here it's been important to keep some of that separate. Sounds like it's been successful with the ideas on this side. With mandates, and I don't know how much of it you can say, but just where do you think mandates with a city like San Francisco, where are you leaning? Like what's important? Is it the existing buildings, be harder on those and catch up some retrofits and our carbon caps like New York City just passed, or where do you think you're leaning with some things coming up?
With respect to the operational carbon side of things, we are starting with new construction major renovations with the idea that ultimately there will be some system in place for existing buildings to be retrofit as well. The mayor recently instructed the Department of the Environment to create a public-private task force to create the roadmap for existing buildings, because we know it will be complicated.
Sure.
So, and that's just the nature of existing buildings. As with everything, the urban fabric of our city that is out the window, that's our biggest lift. And trying to figure out the best ways to engage with people. At what point does action get triggered? What point is interfacing with the city become triggered? It's really different than a typical, much more obvious process when you're doing something brand new.
Gotcha. And I think a lot of cities here in the U.S., for those listening, maybe even international, it's benchmarking ordinances first, right? Share, transparency, accountability with that, and then maybe some forced energy audits, retro commissioning, and then maybe the carbon conversation. Hey, you're a heavy user. We've got to talk about that. So that's the evolution we've seen in some cities. So let's pretend we had a crystal ball, what do you think's around the corner? What should we be reading up on now? Or what's something you had a hunch on that's kind of coming true?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to see embodied carbon considerations finally getting the attention that it needs. I think that is definitely around the corner for us as well. I've been partnering with my colleagues in the Zero Waste program looking at building materials. So thinking, how do we influence the upstream change so that by the time they have to get to it, it's kind of too late, right? So by the time materials get to the zero waste needs, it's already been discarded, right? Sure. So the intent is to think about upstream change and how can we make the shifts necessary so that ultimately it doesn't have questions about how are you going to recover material because it's been already redirected or written out of the game, as it were. Like, how can you design out need? So we're thinking about ideas like building system material banks or design for disassembly. How do you write policy around that? Yeah. How can you measure success with that, especially given it's kind of a longitudinal study, right? It's not something that can be necessarily as clear up front if it's going to be done. Thinking about a lot about construction surplus materials or just what happens with the discards as a result of the degree of churn that we have, whether it's in Class A office space or retail or restaurants. There's a lot of really nice materials that barely had their first life before they're being replaced with another shiny object. So we have to change the way we think about these things. And so we are working on that as one way to address embodied carbon. Yeah. And at the same time, we do have to think about the materials that we're going to use regardless, and how can we reduce the embodied carbon of those materials.
Thank you for validating that, because a few of my podcast guests, Eden, have said it's not just operational carbon, the embodied carbon. Like, we've got to look at that full life cycle. I mean, and you're right, the new construction first, but what can we do with these existing buildings? So let's talk about your career here. What do you think is your specialty or your gift? What are you best at?
I really like mapping things out.
Okay. Do you like mind map, or do you have a certain process?
I map systems. If a new issue comes to my mind, the first thing I like to do is, first step, understand the question, and then determine the scope of the problem and see who has influence, who's impacted, what's their relationship, what is happening today that's happening out of desperation, and what is the optimal system, and what is the best way for these entities to have an exchange. So I really enjoy figuring all that out as a prelude to taking any real action. It kind of gives me the context, which is really important. Context matters, and helps me see the path of least resistance and the path of most leverage in order to have an impact in that area.
Mapping entire systems. As the creative, though, I mean, do you pen and paper? Do you do it digital? What does it look like?
It's a little bit of both. If I do it digitally, I tend to use something like InDesign, not necessarily one of the programs that do the mind mapping for you, because I like to have a little bit more control over where something goes.
Makes sense.
We have a large room with a full-length whiteboard,
cool.
I have been known to spend a few hours on a Friday with several colored markers, just mapping things out and trying to determine where are we going, what do we need here, and who's going to help us.
Right. You got to think about the people part of it too. Do you have any routines or rituals that really help you stay successful, stay on point?
So I mentioned the mapping. I also make lists, that's for sure. And I think that process of kind of going back and making sure, are we still asking the right question? Are we still on track? I think we get so caught up in solutions so quickly that I tend to try to circle back more frequently to, does this address the question? And, does this question address my outcome, my desired outcome?
I like that a lot. I'm a fan of the bucket list. I don't know if there's any adventure, anything on your bucket list, travel, maybe a business milestone, maybe a children's book. What's on the bucket list?
Yeah, that's probably the one list I don't have. It's so interesting. Okay, I think about, of course there's things I'd like to do, but I haven't thought of things in that way. I guess I've been really also very fortunate in my life that I've been exposed to a lot of different things, and I've had had opportunities or I've been open to them.
Sure.
So, of course, I'd love to travel more. I'd love to take, more time to explore, just be able to absorb as much as I can. And at the same time, I'm really happy with the experiences that I've had so far.
No, it's humble. But what's one destination? What's one you're going to get to in the next few years? What's one?
With respect to green building or respect to...
No, just the travel.
Gosh, I really...
skip it.
Sorry, I just really don't know.
No, it's okay. You're doing awesome. This is fun. All right, next, let's talk about books. You've mentioned, especially in school, and just you love books, you love learning. So do you like to pick up a hard copy of a book, or do you listen to books, Audible, or how do you consume books? And do you have a book you'd recommend or two?
Sure. So I still like to feel the book.
Sure, yeah.
So I actually was an apprentice in a print shop.
Oh, wow.
Back when I was in college, and I did handset letter types for a number of smaller things, right? And so I have a tremendous appreciation between that and also doing my master's in visual studies and with books. So I still like that, having that. So I tend to go to the library. I made a rule that I'm not allowed to buy books unless they're true resource, true reference books. And so the library is my friend. I do listen online too. There's no problem with both and, right?
Sure.
But one book that I finally been reading after a couple of years is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth.
Cool.
It's a theory that I've known about, the theory of the donut. It's the whole idea. It's basically a simple and intuitive diagram that frames the safe and just space for humanity. And the inner ring of the donut is the social foundation. And then the outer ring is the ecological ceiling. It's something that we understand on an intuitive level, but it was very interesting to read how the author came to this diagram and what were her influences as an economist to become interested in that in the dynamic.
Sounds fascinating.
How we understand boundaries and how do we really understand that safe space for society, for people to thrive.
So cool. I'm going to put the link in the podcast show notes. Good tip. Thank you. As we start to wrap up here, just kind of a two-part question. One is there any advice you wish you had a little early in your career? Amazing career in this green building movement. And you could also just go to any words of encouragement for someone that's just now jumping in. I mean, you've made some entire systems that are being used today. You're very proud of that. But any words of advice for someone jumping into the green building movement?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think so often we jump in and we kind of, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of pressure on us to get stuff done. And I remember when I was a graduate student, I was just moving because I was on a schedule, right? And my advisor said to me, all in the fullness of time, things, they have their way. And I think that's on one side. On the one side of the spectrum, we have to manage that with the urgency of doing, the urgency of needing to respond to climate emergency that we are, very much facing right now. And as far as for people who are just finding their way into the green building movement, as I said, there's a lot to do. But find that thing that makes your heart sing. What is it that you find as you're talking about it, you start to talk a little faster or a little louder, or you notice that your body's more active. And that's the thing to do, because there's a lot out there that is someone's passion. It doesn't have to be yours. Find what works for you and, welcome.
You really lit up there, and hopefully those listening, you see that everyone we've interviewed here really just, once they get to that passionate work, it's just the energy follows. Just keep going. It's amazing what you've accomplished, Eden. So tell us a little more about that transition, how you were in architecture, and a lot listening might be in architecture right now, but you knew it was time to make a change, or what gave you that nudge?
So I always felt that in architecture, there's a lot of obligation to really understand our impacts. And I was finding, because of the schedules of construction, because essentially pouring a foundation before the design is done in many cases, or you're borrowing from previously published drawing sets, the details to put into another drawing set, because that's the reality of the schedule, that we weren't necessarily taking the time to think about what's the best solution, what's the need for this project. And I didn't really feel like I had the right toolkit to make those decisions. I found that I wanted to have better guidance in some of these areas. And so that's one of the reasons why I made the decision to leave practice and go into outreach, advocacy, education around green building themes. That then took me on another circuitous path, right? That then took me on another route where I realized that there wasn't necessarily the tools that I was looking for. So I found out about the Pharos project in its early days. I became a beta user when I was still practicing in architecture, and slowly was able to join that team. The Living Building Challenge, at the time, I was actually pursuing a PhD, looking at how do we integrate restorative systems into the education for undergraduate architectural studio. How does that become a consideration in how we design? And when I heard about the Living Building Challenge as an idea, I thought, well, wait, maybe I could take the curriculum that I'm creating, which is effectively the same thing, but for a slightly different audience, and try to infuse that with this other program that was intended for practitioners. And that was one of the motivators that got me into Living Building Challenge. I actually started with Cascade as a volunteer because the Portland office didn't have technical support. They didn't have people with technical knowledge of architecture. And so as folks were starting to write questions about Living Building Challenge, I was volunteering time. And that was another way that I was able to sort of help make the case for myself to be the first director of Living Building Challenge when that position became available.
Right place, right time, aha moment, and then you jumped over on the Living Building side. It's so cool. I really enjoyed us being in person here, so thanks for hosting me at your office here at SF Environment. But Eden Brukman, thanks for being on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.